Welcome to the President's Forum podcast, where we explore innovation in higher education. In the month of September, we've asked our presidents to provide advice for an incoming administration about top priorities for higher education. And today we're talking with our chair, UMass Global Chancellor, David Andrews. David has vast experience in higher education. It ranges from R1 institutions like Ohio State University and Johns Hopkins to access-oriented institutions like National University, and now he's at UMass Global. So with his background and his experience that ranges so broadly, it'll be really interesting to hear his perspectives on what the Department of Education should be focused on as a new administration begins. With that, let's get straight to the interview. Good morning, David. Welcome to the podcast.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Hey, I wore my US Open pullover for a reason. I know you're a big tennis guy. We've talked tennis a lot. I don't know if you're watching the US Open, but by the time this episode airs, we may be it may be right before the finals in men's and women's. But I want to test your predictive powers. Is there a chance to have a men's and women's American champ?
There is a chance. And I'm particularly excited about Jessica Pegula because she comes out of the college ranks. And having coached college in the past, it's exciting to see college players, especially on the women's side, move up the way she's moved up. So two of them, actually, Emma Navarro, too, also won the NCAA.
Right.
So two college players still in the mix on the women's side. Love it.
And they're both in opposite brackets. So, I mean, theoretically, they could play each other in the final. That'd be incredible.
Fingers crossed. Yeah.
So what do you think about, do you think Tiafoe or Fritz has a chance to, I mean, we will have an American in the final because they play each other in the semifinal.
Yeah, I think they have a chance. It's going to be exciting. It may be, second fiddle to the semis when they play each other because everyone's going to be so excited about it. It's fun.
Yeah. It's going to, I mean, what an incredible US Open it'd be if we could see two, an American man and an American woman both close out. That'd be great.
Very nice.
Okay. I want to get to higher education. Let's talk. The President's Forum has recently asked all the presidents to answer a question, and we'll start with that question. And that is, what's the counsel that you want to provide to an incoming administration in addressing higher education? And the idea here is, we don't know what administration it'll be, if it'll be a Trump administration or a Harris administration. But, I'd like to think that our ideas are good enough that we don't need to know if it's going to be a Republican or a Democrat administration, because we're going to provide the best counsel we can for both sides of the aisle on education and higher ed, because it shouldn't be a political issue. So let's start with that question. What's your counsel?
I think the most important thing is focusing on improving student outcomes and the student experience together. The Department of Education is obviously going to be the focus, and we know that there's some work to be done there in the department. That work is clearly, I don't think, eliminating it. There's a lot of functions that the department takes on, and including the distribution of resources for students to be able to take advantage of higher ed. Now, stick on the higher ed side of Department of Ed. We need to figure out what are the best ways to maintain innovative approaches to serving students and improving the student experience and the outcomes while having accountability on both sides. I mean, we need to be accountable to the federal government as we're using those resources with our students, and they need to be accountable to us in terms of helping us move to the next level of serving students in what's a rapidly changing landscape.
So you've mentioned a couple things that are kind of connected to each other. So accountability is important, but you can't have accountability without understanding outcomes. How should the department be evaluating outcomes in higher education?
Well, the first thing we need to do is challenge the legacy metrics that we have in place. And there's two of them that I think are important. One is seat time in Carnegie units, the notion that how much time we spend trying to learn something is an outcome. The outcome is how much you actually learned and what value it had in your life trajectory. And how do we get to those kind of outcomes? That we're so wedded to seat time in Carnegie units that we've got to tackle this notion of how do we get away from that. And then the other issue is this notion of substantive interaction with faculty and instruction. I mean, the way we interact with content now and the way we utilize human support to learn things has changed dramatically. We're in an on-demand world. I want to talk to someone when I need to talk to them, not when class starts.
Right.
So how do we think about substantive interaction in these outcomes, the impact that substantive or support for students has for on the outcomes that we're looking for, which is better learning and better earning in the end.
Well, you've seen different models in higher education. You've been at R1 institutions and you've been at access-oriented institutions. So when you're talking about regular and substantive interaction, you've seen the ways that it differs from institutions. Give us a little bit of perspective from those two roles, at an R1 and at an access-oriented institution. How does that change regular and substantive?
Well, there's a couple of things. There's this misnomer that traditional institutions, especially the elites, have spent a lot of time in regular and substantive interactions. I remember teaching at R1's AAU institutions, 250 students at a time. There wasn't a whole lot of substantive interaction going on. You walked in, you did your lecture, you had a bunch of teaching assistants that actually followed up and did the majority of the grading even. So the interactions were limited. So the notion that, we have this romantic notion of small class sizes and substantive interaction. What we see now is the ability to reach out and help students when they need to be helped. With predictive analytics, it can identify which students are struggling without them raising their hand. With analytics that allow us to kind of say, we've seen this profile before of behavior in an online class where we've seen the interaction patterns with the learning management system. We've seen the grading patterns, and we can say, look, this student is headed for trouble and needs some help without them raising their hand. That's much more interactive and substantive in the support for students than anything I ever did in an R1 in a large class. Now, obviously, you've got graduate classes and upper division classes with smaller seminar-based approaches. They're still very valid in that space. But when you're trying to reach a larger number and you have a diverse population of students, you really have to rethink the model. And I would say the last thing is that the traditional institutions who are highly selective have a pretty homogeneous group of students in terms of their ability to take advantage of what you're offering. So you don't have to be as predictive and accurate in being able to reach out to students who are struggling because you've got a homogeneous group of students in terms of the way they learn. So I think there's a real challenge ahead of us and an opportunity ahead of us for the department to think through regulatory processes that continue to support traditional approaches when these non-traditional approaches are critical to open access institutions.
Right. Well, tell us, we know a couple things that aren't the best predictors of quality or outcomes in higher ed, which, the Carnegie unit clearly is an old way to measure learning, and regular and substantive is being changed because of all the technology we have and personalized education. And so that's clearly changing. Tell us, what do you think the future of quality measures in higher ed, what does that look like? Where should the department be moving on that?
Well, I think trying to create a model that shows growth or lift. How did the institution support a student from point A to point B? Otherwise, we depend on who gets in, who gets into the institution. So the starting point of a student is really important to understand and compare with the endpoint. Now, we had this in the K-12 space. We had a failed effort around value-added measures. It's tough to measure. I'm not going to say it's easy to measure. It's difficult to measure. Some of our professional associations who are accrediting us on top of generic accreditation are tackling this and seeing what kind of lift you're getting to move students forward. We also have earning metrics but just simply raw salary is not helpful. It's what's the change, what's the lift that you got. So this notion of growth and lift in students, not only in what they learn, but the relevance of that learning to their life course. we have to tackle this, and we've avoided it, I think, because it's hard. I mean, it's really difficult to measure,
Yeah.
but we're more than willing to be partners in that effort to try to figure that out. Competency-based approaches are moving in that direction, but it's all about the assessments and the measurement.
I remember, not too long ago, there was a similar and analogous situation in healthcare where there's been this push to measure how effective and how productive physicians are. And one of the issues has always been, well, I mean, that disincentivizes treating the severely ill patients because your outcomes may not show that you're an excellent physician because you're taking on the most challenging cases. I think that could be said in higher education as well. I mean, it's really easy to show off, your incredible outcomes when you're at a top elite institution that tells 99% of applicants no, and only opens the doors to the most, the brightest, the those who have had the best situation in education prior. It's harder to get into communities and educate those who haven't had those advantages in life. So I don't know exactly how you start to measure that. Do you have any ideas there?
Again, there are a number of lessons learned from the K-12 space, both bad and good. We've had these arguments around charter schools in the same way. Charter schools, do they go in and serve underserved communities, or do they cherry pick out of those communities those who are able to take advantage of what they're offering? So the selectivity on the front end is in some ways the enemy of open access. And these metrics that we need to develop really should say, how much value did the credential get? And I won't even say degrees, because sometimes we need to think about shorter form credentials and momentum building credentials that are outcomes that may eventually lead to a degree. But for some of our working adults, not necessarily. So, I mean, the challenge is broadening the definition of these outcomes and then working hard to make sure that they're fair and consistent ways of applying those things. And I think medicine is a good example. They'll also tell you that we have to do this in real time, that the autopsy is always 100% accurate, but the predictive analytics we need in order to support students and assure that they survive, that they live, that they thrive based on the credential you give them, needs to be done in real time. So we can't wait. And earnings is a problem with that. So earnings data 10 years later is not helping us because those students have already run the course. So it might help inform from a retrospective point of view, but it's not helping us real time make sure we're adding value to the trajectory of students. And these are tough discussions to have. The easiest thing to default back to is seat time and being in and having you hear the term having a great professor in front of every classroom. There's so much wrong with that because that's an antiquated model. It doesn't meet students where they are, and it really doesn't adhere to this increasing demand for help me when I need it and give me just enough to get to the next level. And our system's not set up to support that approach.
I love the concept, though, of measuring lift. Because there are challenges in doing that, but that's the actual measurement that we're looking for, right? We're looking at how much does a higher ed institution add to an individual? Without the institution, where would the individual be? With that education from that institution of higher ed, where are they now? And if you can measure that delta there, I think you have an incredible measurement for outcomes. So that's our challenge, is how we measure lift.
Exactly.
Well, okay. So we talk at the President's Forum all about innovation. We talk about it all the time. And I want to know from your perspective, we talk about innovation in terms of, without student outcomes, innovation really isn't anything. Can you give us your take on what is innovation? What does that word mean for the Department of Education? And how should the department be thinking about innovation generally as they try to look at things like lift and outcome measurements that are a little bit different than what we've been used to for the past 50 years to a century?
Well, I think there's a real opportunity to pilot some things. I mean, there's a fear around quick implementation of innovations where you don't know what the outcome is, and there are unintended consequences, iatrogenic effects, they call it in medicine. Your unintended consequences of changing things. And if you're a regulatory agency exclusively, you're paranoid about the potential impact that you haven't anticipated. So I think one of the ways of handling that is to increase the investment in innovation pilots and ways of testing things out so we get enough evidence to see what the impact is. And, we've done that through IES and other institutions, but we need to really figure out in the post-secondary space, especially around working adult learners, how do we get some resources in place to test out some of these innovations? I think there was a good movement along that with a direct assessment and competency-based education, but
Right.
That's been a long time ago now. What's next in terms of putting these pilots in place and then tracking those things very carefully and seeing what we can take to scale. And I think the institutions in the President's Forum are uniquely positioned to do that because we're a pretty innovative group. And we have scale. We have enough students to actually run pilots that are large enough to determine whether or not there's any efficacy in the approach, and to track these unintended consequences or iatrogenic effects.
So what I'm hearing, I don't want to put this word in your mouth, but I want to hear from you. Would you support the department taking some more risk as a regulated, as an executive agency in piloting different approaches?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And whether it's through a division that currently exists or a creation of a new division, we're talking about advice to future administrations. How do you get that cutting edge innovation framework in place so that there are resources and again, we did it in the K-12 space with I3 grants that were available, and they started with, hey, that's a good idea. Second level with more money that's a good idea, and there's some early data that says it works. And then the third level is, how do you scale it? And there's lots of money then in scaling those things. So these are not new concepts to the Department of Education, but they are less familiar in the post-secondary space, especially when you're dealing with students who have not taken a straight line course to completing their degrees or their credentials. And we are in the post-secondary space able to cherry pick students, especially the elites. And when you do that, there's not as much motivation for innovation. But we need a system in place if we're really serious about open access, to explore these new mechanisms that are emerging that would be more supportive of our students.
I like this counsel. My takeaways from this conversation are: look at outcomes, be willing to measure outcomes differently, look for ways that we can better measure lift in those outcomes, and focus our regulatory work around that kind of a measurement rather than seat time and the regular substantive that we're used to right now. Does that sound like the right takeaways from this conversation?
Absolutely. And I would add to that, build collaborative and trusting approaches with accreditors. We've got kind of a duplication of effort on the regulatory side with accreditation and the department. And I think you could streamline the process and open up for more innovation if they were working more closely together.
Yeah, great point. Well, hey, we appreciate this conversation, David. Thanks for taking time to join us today, and we'll look forward to having you back on in the near future.
Thanks for having me. Fun.
Thanks.